Hello, my name is Lingyuan Yan, and we're a team of high school students from the Lowell Masters Club. Today I'm here with Ms. Dawn, the Associate Director of Museum Services at the Wing Luke Museum.
Wing Luke was the first person of color elected to the Seattle City Council and the first Chinese American elected government official in the Pacific Northwest. He is remembered today for his contributions to the civil rights movement and honored as an important figure in Chinese American history. This museum, located deep within Seattle's Chinatown, exists not only to honor the legacy of Wing Luke, but also to honor the cultural diversity and shared history of all Asian immigrants in the local community. On this visit, we came to learn more about Wing Luke's story while getting a chance to see this beautiful museum with our own eyes.
Sure. So Wing Luke was born in 1925. He immigrated from the southern region of China, Canton, or Guangdong province, when he was just 6 years old. When he was growing up, he was one of the few families that actually didn't live in the Chinatown International District neighborhood. So they actually had a laundromat up north. And so when you come to the Wing Luke Museum, you can see his school photo. He's the only Chinese boy in his class. And you can kind of guess what his experience was like being the only boy of Chinese heritage out of the other students who were more European heritage. So a student who speaks another language, a student who might wear different style of clothing, or perhaps having different types of food that they might bring for lunch. Sometimes kids can be a little mean and bully someone for looking a little bit different or making them feel like they don't belong. But Wing was somebody who really loved art, comic books, telling jokes, being funny. That was his way to connect with people at school, to let him know like he was kind of just a regular student like the rest of them. And so he would actually draw comic strips of things that would happen at school every day with the kids in his drawings. And the kids really got excited to see what he was going to draw next, wanted to get to know him, to see his comic strips. And that was kind of like his superpower growing up, how to connect with people even if they were different from him. And it would carry him through his life as he grew older. Yeah, so kind of what I touched upon, him being of Chinese heritage. If you study Chinese immigration history, right, the reason why we have a lot of Chinese immigrant waves coming in, well, first wave coming in, 1849, California Gold Rush is where we see a lot of Chinese immigrants coming from that southern Guangdong region to look for that gold mountain, right? But of course, when they come here, there's no gold mountain. There's no gold paved in the streets where it's easy to just find that money to take care of their family overseas. So what you have happening is these Chinese immigrants finding ways to make this journey work for them, even though that plan didn't kind of go how they wanted to. So some people will go work on the transcontinental railroad that would connect the east and west coast of the United States together. You had people going into fishing, you had people going into the lumber industry. For a lot of Chinese immigrant men, when the West was still developing, it was still a very dangerous, like risky time. You don't know what's gonna happen, but everyone's trying to just make that money, right? So women, usually Chinese women, stay back at home to make sure, like, if they, you know, they get married to those men coming on over, so that the men have a reason to bring back money, right? That's like that insurance. But so since there weren't a lot of women in the West, that's where jobs that were considered women's work back then, cleaning, cooking, just domestic labor, right? There was a need for that. And a lot of the different immigrants coming to the United States, other men at that time wouldn't take up those jobs, but a lot of Chinese immigrant men would take up those roles, and that's why we see historically a lot of laundromats and restaurants and stuff like that. So you have Chinese immigrants coming into the United States, trying to make that money to support their family, just like the other immigrants coming into the United States too. But so that challenge that we're seeing for Chinese immigrants is that there's this idea of who gets to be seen as an American and who doesn't get to be seen as one. So even though you have all these immigrant groups coming into the United States vying for the jobs, trying to get that money, just because of the way that Chinese immigrants look, the culture that they're bringing in, right? Those are things that are being seen as un-American, or, you know, those are being seen as the other, right? So talking about Wing Luke and his experience, this is kind of what's been set up and what he's coming into as he starts his family growth, community growing in the United States. Yeah, so Wing Luke's story, like, I didn't mention it yet, but he would go serve in the military during the Second World War when he was 18 years old. This was an avenue for a lot of people who could not become a naturalized citizen to get citizenship in the United States. And so that was his way of also proving, right, that he is an American citizen, he's here to serve the country, whatever. And during the time that he was doing his service, this was 1942, World War II time, heightened anti-Japanese sentiment during that era. But, you know, people weren't going to ask you, are you Chinese, are you Japanese, are you Filipino? They look at your face, they're going to make a snap judgment, right? And if they don't feel that you're a safe person, they're going to react to you in a certain way. So the landlady who had rented out the space for them to have their laundromat business tripled the rent rate to push them out of that space. So that's what would have Wing Luke take a furlough from his service time to come back home, help his family move, and from those racist experiences, right, that was put upon his family to have to uproot and change their living system, their work, right, that would push him to want to become more educated, to understand how to address those kind of unfair practices, how to leverage his leadership in representing the community. So redlining and segregation was also something in effect, and so he knew firsthand what that felt like, and, you know, wanting to address those things, and that would lead him towards that direction. Yeah, so Native American fishing rights, I'll have to look up the name of it, but like if you do a Google search, right, understanding the places that you're in you're not the only person who's there, right? So for Chinatown to exist here, we have to recognize that before Chinatown happened, it was the Coast Salish, right? It was the indigenous tribes who were here first, who got pushed out, right? And they were actually banned by the city from living in their own land, the indigenous tribes. So I think for Wing Luke, somebody who experienced that displacement himself, is why he wanted to make sure communities, even if they weren't the same as his, were also being taken care of and being represented, especially when they didn't have anybody who could represent them. So really thinking about, it's not just the Chinese immigrant experience, but the people of color experience, right? We can see where there's these intersections, where there's commonality. And once we understand where our stories intersect, that's where more power can come together to take care of the communities that aren't being taken care of by other folks, right? So fishing rights, like that's an integral part of their community, being able to live and sustain on their own land, and making sure that the indigenous population can still do that makes them who they are, and so they can continue to be themselves. Sure. So I talked a little bit about their displacement that happened during World War II. Before we even get to that point, before he goes off to do his military service, he was active in school, ASB, like club at Roosevelt High School. It's really interesting to come across how, as a child, elementary school, he was picked on by certain kids as his bullies, but those same kids would get to know him and come to support him later on in life when he's that high school student trying to be elected to be that leader. So you can kind of see how that building of trust happens, and it continues as he grows older and continues to represent his community in that way. Most important policies. So the fishing rights, I think, is really important to acknowledge, the fact that, when we learn about Native Americans or indigenous groups, oftentimes people think that they don't exist anymore, but they very much still do. And so how can we still be supportive of these marginalized groups in our efforts? Open housing was something that he was a big part of. So talking about that redlining and segregation, Wing was someone who helped to make sure that people could live where they wanted to in Seattle. So that actually didn't happen in his lifetime because he passed away in 1965. But it was immediately after Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated that the United States then made it a point to have open housing. So it's kind of interesting to see the events there. And, places in Seattle that people attribute to as big, important tourist attractions, say Seattle's Pike Place Market, right? That is a really big place that folks will think about, about Seattle, but there was a time that folks in the city wanted to get rid of it because of Japanese farmers and vendors that were there before World War II. So then World War II time happened, and they're like, we gotta erase anything that is about them because we're at war with them, right? But Wing recognizes that there's complexity in history in different spaces, but to honor different communities and their contributions to our city's history, like preserving those spaces, is how we can remember those stories. Yes, so when Wing was elected to the Seattle City Council in 1962, I think he was well perceived because he had done a lot of his work around supporting people in getting homes in places that they might have not gotten access to in Seattle. Like when he was running for his election, it wasn't as though he only pandered to one group, but rather, worked with so many different ethnic groups, right? That they had gotten to know him and trust him in that way for him to win in that landslide election that he had. So he wanted to have a museum that honored the Chinese immigrant experience. So maybe you saw the shoes outside in the exhibit space, but he found those shoes in the basement of one of the local stores here. And it's like the shoes that the laborers, the Chinese laborers would wear in that, in the early 1900s. So he wanted to have those shoes on display so that people could remember, right? That there was a lot of struggles for the immigrants when they first came to pave the way that we have now, right? Like, it wasn't always an easy thing, but to be able to remember that, to be able to honor that, and just kind of see that progress, I think that's a big part of, that's something that he had envisioned, but he had died before that happened. So when he passed away, lots of family members, friends, they all put in money to help search for the remains of the crash site. It took a little while to find it, and so some of the money that was saved was used to create the Wing Luk Memorial Foundation in 1967. So that was our first museum location. It was probably half the size of this theater. And then we moved to our second location, which is the theater off Jackson. It was like an old garage space. And then in 2008, we opened up our doors in this building, which was built in 1910. And this was home to Chinese immigrant workers. And so it's kind of like a beautiful way to continue Wing Luk's legacy, right? In preserving of spaces, keeping that history alive. And here at the Wing Luk Museum today, it's not just that Chinese immigrant story, but we focus on that. But then what does it look like when time is still passing, right? And there's more groups who are still coming in, and what's the difference between immigrant refugee situation? So it's kind of grown in a lot of big ways to highlight the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander experience. So when I was a kid, was like Wing Luk too. I was the only Vietnamese student in the classroom, or maybe there would be another one like two, but not as many. And so this feeling of being perhaps alone, or thinking that, no one understands us as this like one Asian kid in the class, right? I think that's where I gravitated to Wing Luk, in seeing my experience also kind of being similar to his. I was bullied too, but and I actually did draw, but instead of, being like Wing Luk and being able to connect in that way, I kind of did my art in different ways and kind of wanted to go in that direction. But it's really powerful. When I went to the school at the University of Washington, just like Wing Luk too, being a student and seeing an educator who looked like me was probably a really powerful experience in me wanting to head towards education, to do my work here at the Wing Luk Museum. And so I feel like representation is really important. And so for Wing, just being this guy who experiences these daily things that we do, this is where we can find different points that we can connect, and then see him as a leader and what kinds of stuff you can do in these different kind of fields, and what kind of changes we can make, right? Yeah, so when the museum first had opened up as that memorial for Wing Luk, it was more focused on textiles and pottery, Chinese, those kinds of things. And so the picture that you saw out in the lobby with our former executive director, Ron Chu, and I think Hillary Clinton was in the picture too. That was when our museum was recognized for our community-based programming. So our museum is very different in terms of traditional museums where you have people who take things and then they put it on display. Here, the museum, our exhibitions are all community-based. So we might have a theme that we visit every 10 years or so. Let's say beauty, okay? And we might invite different people who have experience in whatever fields, but just as long as they have something that they want to say about that theme, that means every single time you have different people at the table, different voices, different ideas that are showing up to talk about that same theme. So no exhibit is alike. For Ron, when we had that executive director, Ron Shu, this was around early 2000s, right, that we made this transition and became nationally known for this. Ron Shu was very all about doing these oral histories with people in the community, right? Sometimes we don't think of ourselves as special enough to have our stories told, but if you think about it, every single one of you watching this, right? You all have a story. You all have a family history of how your family got to where you are, how you got to the schools that you're in, how you're connected to the Little Masters Club, right? All of those stories is American history as a whole, right? So Ron Shu was really about talking to the people in the Chinatown International District. And, you know, Chinatown definitely, for sure, is how we have this neighborhood. That's why we have such a long name in this community. International District is recognizing there's more than a Chinatown. So we have a Japantown, Filipino town. 1980s, after Vietnam War, is where we have Little Saigon, right? So Ron Shu was talking to people in the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. So that's how it kind of got bigger from just Chinese focus.